Hey guys, this is Angie and this is the fabric I'm using for the next quilt. I'm using 5 patterns of fabric and a solid. We need 1 yard of 3 patterns, a half a yard of 2 patterns, and then a yard of solid. The quilt pattern that I'm using is from the Quilts and More magazine. Since I'm a visual person and I struggle with instructions, what I did was I copied the quilt pattern from the magazine, and then I decided where to place my fabric blocks. So I chose the big flower pattern for pattern number 1, that's in the upper left corner. And blocks 2 and 3 I switched after I filmed the video. So the solid blue color is going to be number 2 instead of 3. And then the lines is pattern 3. The chocolate is pattern 4 and the diagonals are pattern 5. And then I'm going to be using eggshell for the white blocks that you see here in the picture. Okay, so next I'm going to press my fabric, but I'm not going to film that step, okay? Okay, we're starting with pattern number 1 and we're going to trim off the selvage. Now we're going to flip this over. Our ends are cleaned up. And our first cut is going to be at 8.5 inches. And we're going to need 2 of those. So this is my 8.5 inch ruler, and I'm just going to make sure that I line everything up perfectly, or as best I can. Okay, now we need a second piece that measures 8.5 inches. So far we've made 2 cuts at 8.5 inches, and next we need to cut at 6.5 inches. And we need 2 strips that measure 6.5 inches. Okay, we're going to start with our 8.5 inch strips, and we need to cut 20 pieces that measure 8.5 by 3.5. I'm going to start out by trimming the selvage. Now we're going to cut at the 3.5 inches, and we need 20 of these. You get 2 pieces per cut. So we need to cut this size 10 times. I'm going to fast forward the other 9 times. Okay, so now we've got the 6.5 inch strips, and we're going to cut them at 2.5 inches. We need 20 pieces that measure 6.5 by 2.5. We're going to start out by trimming off the selvage first. Once we've got that done, then we're going to cut at 2.5 inches. So let me turn this over. And I'm going to get my 2.5 inch ruler. Now we're cutting at the 2.5 inches, and I love this little neon ruler for 2.5 inch cuts. As a reminder, we're going to need 20 of these that measure 2.5 by 6.5, and I'm going to fast forward through the cutting. I'm going to cut one and then I'll fast forward. Okay, we're ready for pattern 2, but let's recap pattern 1. We have 20 pieces that measure 8.5 by 3.5, and then we have 20 pieces that measure 6.5 by 2.5. We're going to cut pattern 2 now, and I've already cut off the selvage, and we're ready to make our first cut at 12.5 inches. To get 12.5 inches, I'm using 2 rulers. The first ruler is 6.5 inches, and the second ruler I'm lining up at the 6 inch mark to give me 12.5 inches. I learned this technique on YouTube, and I like how accurate it is. So let's go ahead and cut 2 pieces that measure 12.5 inches. I'm going to fast forward through the second cut. Now we're cutting the 12.5 strips at 4.5, and we need 12 of these that measure 12.5 by 4.5. So I'm going to cut this first piece at 4.5, and then I'll fast forward through the rest of them. Okay, so now we need 12 pieces that measure 4.5 by 2.5. I'm going to take this leftover 12.5 inch strip, and I'm going to cut 2.5 inch strips, and then we're going to cut those down to measure 2.5 by 4.5. So I'm going to line this up as best I can. Sometimes it's hard to line up lines with lines. I'm just making sure it's lined up, and then cut at 2.5. I'm going to fast forward through the rest of them. Okay, we need to cut these 2.5-inch strips at 4.5 inches, and we need 12 of them. So I'm going to make my first cut here at 4.5, and I'm going to cut the first one here and then fast forward through the rest because again they measure 4.5 by 2.5 and we need 12 of them. We're done with pattern 2, and here's a recap. We've cut 12 pieces that measure 12.5 by 4.5 and 12 pieces that measure 4.5 by 2.5. Okay, so now we're on pattern 3 and we need to cut 2 pieces at 12.5 inches. I'll make the first cut and then fast forward. Okay, so now we're cutting the 12.5-inch pieces at 4.5. So we need 12 of those that measure 12.5 by 4.5. I'll make this first cut and then I'll fast forward through the rest of them. Okay, so now we need 12 pieces cut at 2.5 and then by 4.5. So I'm going to make the 2.5-inch cut first, and I'm just going to cut one of them on camera and then I'll fast forward the rest and then I'll be back to cut those strips at 4.5. We're going to cut these 2.5-inch pieces at 4.5 and we need 12 of those. So I'm going to show you this first one and then I'm going to fast forward through the rest. Okay, so now we're on pattern 4 and we need 8 pieces that measure 12.5 by 4.5. So we're going to cut at 12.5 first, and then our next, that leftover piece there, we're going to cut that at 4.5. And this is one of those fabrics that I mentioned we only needed 1/2 yard. So I'm going to get my ruler here and slide over my 12.5-inch piece and then cut this remaining piece at 4.5. Just making sure that I've got everything lined up. Now we're taking the 12.5-inch strip and we're cutting it at 4.5 inches. I'm going to film the first cut and then fast forward. And right here, I'm just trying to make sure that I have it lined up exactly before I cut. Okay, so now I have the 4.5-inch strip and I'm cutting it at 2.5, and we need 8 pieces that measure 4.5 by 2.5. I'm going to cut the first one and then fast forward the rest. Okay, so we're on pattern 5 now. We're going to make our first cut at 12.5 inches, and this is just like pattern 4. Okay, our next piece is going to get cut at 4.5 inches, and we just need one of these. Okay, we've got our 12.5-inch strip, and we're cutting it at 4.5 inches. Again, we're going to need 8 of these. I'm going to cut one on camera, and then I will fast forward the rest. Now I'm cutting the 4.5-inch strip at 2.5 inches. Again, we're going to need 8 of those. So I'll cut this first one and then fast forward the rest. Okay, now we're working on our solid fabric. We need 20 pieces that measure 8.5 by 4.5. I'm cutting at 8.5. I'll cut the first one on camera, and we need a total of 3 of these strips. Okay, our next cut is at 6.5 inches, and you're going to need 2 of these strips that measure 6.5 inches. Okay, I've got the 8.5-inch strip, and now we're cutting it at 4.5. Again, we need 20 of these that measure 8.5 by 4.5, and I'll cut the first one on camera and fast forward the rest. Now we're cutting our 6.5-inch strip at 4.5, and we need 10 of them. Okay, so here's a recap of our fabric. I'm going to check my notes to make sure I'm telling you the right thing. So pattern 1 has 20 pieces that measure 8.5 by 3.5, and then 20 pieces that measure 2.5 by 6.5. Patterns 2 and 3 have the same exact measurements, and I did switch those around. So pattern 2 is 12 pieces that measure 4.5 by 12.5, and 12 pieces that measure 2.5 by 4.5. And then pattern 3, same thing, 12 pieces that measure 4.5 by 12.5, and 12 pieces that measure 2.5 by 4.5. Now we're going to move on to patterns 4 and 5. Those have the exact same measurements. and the same amount of pieces. So we need 8 pieces that measure 4.5 by 12.5 and 8 pieces that measure 2.5 by 4.5. Same thing for pattern 5. 8 pieces that are 4.5 by 12.5 and 8 pieces 2.5 by 4.5. Now we're going to move to our solid. That is going to be 10 pieces that measure 4.5 by 6.5 and then 20 pieces that measure 8.5 by 4.5. Okay, so now we're ready to start piecing our blocks together. Okay, we're ready to sew, and I want to explain the blocks before we start. We have an A block and a B block. We're going to have 10 A blocks, 20 B blocks, but let's start with A block. It measures 12.5 by 8.5 after we've sewn them. And so for the A block, we're going to start with sewing one rectangle, the solid, that measures 4.5 by 6.5 to 2 small rectangles that measure 2.5 by 6.5. What we're going to do after we sew them is press the seams open, and then we're going to take the 2 other rectangles that measure 3.5 by 8.5, and we're going to sew them to the left and to the right. And so then we'll also press those seams to the dark side as well. So now for B block, the other patterns of fabric is going to be the B block, okay? And you're going to have 20 of those. It's going to measure 12.5 by 12.5, and what you're going to do is sew one white or solid rectangle to the 4.5 by 8.5, to 2 of those rectangles, and then you're going to sew the rectangle to the left and to the right. That measures 4.5 by 12.5. We're going to press the seams to the dark side again. Okay, so everything that we just discussed is going to be shown in the rest of this video, okay?
Okay guys, so we're going to chain sew, and what I'm going to do is sew one of these to that, and then when we get all of them done on one side, then we'll take the rest of the stack and add it. So I'm not going to show all of them, but I'll record a few of them, and then when we get to the next step, I'll show you that, okay? So you can pin these if you want. Since it's such a small piece of fabric, I'm actually not going to pin mine, okay? So I'm going to put my needle down. Okay, so remember I said I'm just going to chain sew. This makes this quilt go a whole lot faster since we did quite a bit of cutting. Okay, so I'm just going to line that right up. I want to make sure I've still got this straight. Yep. Okay, so I've got all of these sewn, and what I want to do now is separate them with my little clippers here. And I won't make you watch me do all of them. So then what we're going to do now is we're going to then add this one to this side. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to chain sew. So let me put this on here. Okay. Okay, so here we go. Okay, so I've got all of these sewn together. You can see it just like that. And Now I'm going to take it over to my iron and I'm going to press the seam to the dark side, okay? So both of those are going to get pressed to the dark side. And then when I come back, we're going to take this piece here and we're going to sew it right there, okay? So I'll be back. Okay, so I'm back. I've got these all pressed. As you can see, I've pressed the seam to the dark side. And now I'm just going to take this piece and I'm going to sew it and then chain sew again. And then when I'm done with this side, I'm going to come over and add another one over here on that side. Okay, so I'm just going to show you a couple and then I'm going to turn the camera off. It's all the same as long as we're sewing. Okay, get my thread out of the way. Okay, so I've got this side sewn on. Now we're ready for this piece. And then once we sew this on, block A will be complete. And so we'll press the seams again, and then we'll start on block number 2. Okay, so here is block A, and I'm going to take it to this over to the iron and press the seams to the dark side. And so all of my A blocks are almost done. Next we'll start on the B block.
Okay, we left off with video 2, wrapping up block A, and this is how it looks. Now we're ready to sew our B blocks. And let me show you what that's going to look like. I've gone ahead and done a few in advance, and the reason is because I'm not going to film the sewing. It's the same process as block A. The only difference is the size of the rectangle. So you're going to start with this small rectangle and you're going to sew it onto the solid rectangle, one at the top, one at the bottom, just like before, and then press your seams to the dark side. After that's done, you're going to add your rectangles to each side. Sew those and then press them to the dark side. And I'm going to show you my seams on this example here. I've sewn them or pressed them to the dark side. So now let me show you what you're going to do after you've sewn all your blocks together. What you're going to do is square up your rectangle. So I'm going to move these out of my way so that I can show you what I mean. So I'm going to take this example right here, and you can't see it real well in my video, but I'm going to take the ruler, I'm going to line it up to the edge, and I'm going to find that there's a smidge of one piece that's maybe hanging over too far. You don't want to cut too much, but you want to make sure that your sides are lined up. So you're going to see here that there's a little bit of fuzz there. You want to do that on both sides of all your blocks, okay? So I'm just going to line it up again and see if there's any wonky edges. And what this does is this helps when we're sewing our rows together. Okay, so next I'll be placing these blocks on my quilt wall, and I'll take a picture and explain it. Okay, so I've placed my blocks on my quilt wall and everything looks really good, and so now I'm ready to sew the rows together. For this quilt you will be sewing them in vertical rows. That means from top to bottom, not left to right, okay? So vertical rows.
Okay, so I've got all of my rows stacked up. We have row 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. You can see my pin here that says row 4. And so what I'm going to do now is pin all the blocks together. Okay, I'm going to show you how to pin these. I've zoomed in so you can see a little bit better. This is the top of row 5. So what I'm going to do is take and turn it upside down. So here's 5. I'm going to take the second block and I'm going to line it up and pin it. And I'm going to pin it in 3 spots, okay? And then I'm going to flip this over and then take the next block and pin that. So we're pinning them right sides together. Okay, same thing. And then same thing. Whoops. And then last is this one. And then I'm going to take this over to my sewing machine and I'm going to sew it. Okay, so now we're going to sew the first block to the second block on row 1. Okay, I'm going to take the pins out of the first block. And now we are ready to sew the next one, okay? So that one's going to go under. And now we're ready for our second square. Same thing, I'm going to take the pins out. And then I'm going to sew the next one. Okay, remove the pins. And now we're ready for the next block. Okay, this is the last block on row 1, okay?
Okay, I've got the first row sewn together. You can see here that block 1 is sewn to block 2, and then block 2 is sewn to block 3, and so on. So now what I want to do is press all the seams going in one direction. So this is row 1. I'm going to press all the seams going up. Then on row 2, I want to press the seams going in the opposite direction, which would be going down. And you're going to alternate those on each row, okay? Okay, so now I'm going to pin row 2 to row 1. You can see here that this is row 1 with my little pin there. I'm going to turn these right sides facing together and I'm going to pin it and then I'm going to sew it. This quilt doesn't have very many seams to line up. There's like one in the middle. So I'm just going to start here at the very top and then pin it. Okay, so now I'm sewing row 1 to row 2, and I'm just going to film just a little bit of this, and then the next time you see me, we will have all the rows sewn together, okay? Okay, our frame quilt is complete and it's time to measure it to determine how much fabric we need for the binding and the backing. I've already measured it off camera and it measures 60 inches wide by 63 and a half. And so that means we need 4 yards of backing and a half a yard of binding. And now I'm going to show you my backing and binding fabric. Just remember to check with your long arm quilter. So this is my backing fabric, that's 4 yards. And this is my binding fabric. Don't forget, check with your long arm quilter. Okay, if you need anything, let me know. Thanks a lot. Bye.